The words hit me like ice water on a summer morning. "You're too old for long flights, Grandma. Just watch the house." My son David barely looked up from his phone as he said it, while my daughter-in-law Patricia nodded in agreement, already mentally packing their suitcases for their European adventure. 47 years I'd been taking care of this family, raising children, managing households, being the invisible foundation everyone stood on. And now I was nothing more than a house sitter, a piece of furniture with a pulse. But as I watched them drive away that Tuesday morning, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the way Patricia had handed me a list of household instructions, like I was the hired help. Or maybe it was finding those plane tickets they'd carelessly left on the kitchen counter. 3 tickets to Portugal that had originally included my name before they decided I was too much trouble for their dream vacation. The whiteout over my name was still visible, a small scar that told the story of how expendable I'd become. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. The morning after they left, I wasn't just watching their house anymore. I was planning my escape. Before I continue, if this story speaks to you, like the video and subscribe. It helps more people hear stories like mine. Now, let me tell you what I did next. I sat in my old rocking chair at 6 in the morning, staring at those crumpled tickets on the coffee table. 3 seats to Lisbon, but only 2 names remained. Mr. and Mrs. David Morrison. Mine had been carefully erased, like I'd never existed at all. The silence in this house felt different now. Not peaceful, but hollow, like a tomb where dreams go to die. I'd spent 47 years making this place a home, painting these walls the colors David liked, planting the garden Patricia now claimed as her own design, raising the man who just told me I was too old to dream. The morning light streamed through windows I'd cleaned 1,000 times, illuminating dust motes that danced freely while I sat, trapped in routines that had become my prison. This house held 47 years of my life, every corner filled with memories of the woman I used to be before I learned to make myself smaller. The kitchen where I'd made birthday cakes they barely thanked me for. The living room where I'd wrapped Christmas presents they opened without looking at who gave them. I picked up those tickets with trembling fingers, studying the flight details, the seat assignments, the departure times. David and Patricia were probably already at the airport by now, excited about their romantic getaway to the Portuguese coast. They'd walk those cobblestone streets hand in hand, taste wine in ancient cellars, watch sunsets over the Atlantic, all the things I'd dreamed of doing with my late husband before cancer stole that chance away. For a moment I felt the familiar weight of bitterness settling over my shoulders like an old heavy coat. They had everything: youth, health, love, money, time, and still, they couldn't spare an ounce of kindness for the woman who had given them the foundation to build their perfect life upon. I could see them now, posting photos on social media, captioning them with lies about missing me when they'd never intended to include me in the first place. The cruelty wasn't in the exclusion itself, but in the casual way they'd done it. Like erasing my name was as natural as I erasing a mistake from a grocery list. But then something unprecedented happened. Instead of folding inward like I always did, instead of making excuses for their cruelty or finding ways to blame myself, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Righteous anger. Not the destructive kind that burns everything down, but the purifying kind that burns away excuses and illuminates truth. I was 73 years old. I had my health. I had savings they didn't even know about. And I had a passport that hadn't seen daylight in 20 years. Most importantly, I had absolutely nothing left to lose by finally choosing myself. The realization hit me like a physical force. I had been living my life in the waiting room of other people's happiness, always ready to be called upon but never invited to the actual celebration. I had been the supporting character in my own story for so long that I'd forgotten I was supposed to be the heroine. But heroines don't wait for permission to live their lives, and I was done asking for invitations to my own existence. I walked to the kitchen and made myself a proper cup of tea, not the quick microwave version I'd been settling for, when I felt guilty about taking time for small pleasures, I used the good china, the set my mother had given me, that I'd been saving for special occasions for 30 years. If planning your first act of rebellion at 73 wasn't a special occasion, what was? The tea tasted different when I wasn't rushing, when I wasn't mentally cataloging all the things I should be doing for other people, instead of sitting quietly with my own thoughts. The delicate floral pattern on the cup seemed to mock me. How many special occasions had I missed while waiting for the right moment to use beautiful things? How many small joys had I denied myself because I'd been taught that self-care was selfish and that good mothers always put themselves last? I sipped that tea like it was medicine, like it was the antidote to 47 years of making myself invisible in my own life. As I sipped that tea, I made a mental inventory of my resources. I had $23,847 in a savings account David didn't know about. Money I'd been squirreling away from my Social Security checks, telling myself it was for emergencies. Well, this was an emergency of the soul, a code red for a woman who was disappearing one compromise at a time. I had a passport, I had a body that could still carry me places, and I had a heart that was finally tired of breaking in silence. I had wisdom earned through decades of putting others first, and I had the sudden, startling realization that wisdom without action is just another form of suffering. I had survived my husband's death, raised a son as a single mother, built a life from nothing, and somehow, along the way, I'd convinced myself I was too fragile to handle an airplane ride. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. I was stronger than I'd ever given myself credit for, and it was time I started acting like it. The phone sat on the counter like a dare. I could call the airline. I could cancel their tickets. I could book something for myself. For 47 years, I'd been the woman who made things happen for everyone else. Today I was going to make something happen for Eleanor. I picked up that phone, and for the first time in decades, my hands didn't shake when I dialed a number that would change my life. The woman on the other end had a professional voice that turned gentle when I explained what I needed to do. "Cancel the tickets?" she asked, and I could hear the confusion in her tone. "Yes," I said firmly, "and I'd like to book a new trip. Just for me." There was a pause, then the sound of typing, and suddenly, I was planning a journey that belonged entirely to Eleanor Morrison, not to someone's mother or grandmother or caretaker, but to me. As I gave her my credit card information, I felt like I was purchasing more than a plane ticket. I was buying back my own life, one decision at a time. The airline representative had a kind voice that reminded me of my late sister, Margaret. "How can I help you today, ma'am?" she asked, and I felt dizzy with the possibility of what I was about to do. "I need to cancel 2 tickets to Lisbon," I said, my voice steadier than it had been in years. There was a pause as she pulled up the reservation, and I could hear the clicking of computer keys that sounded like tiny applause for my courage. I imagined David and Patricia standing at the airport, realizing their tickets had been cancelled, trying to understand how their reliable, predictable Eleanor had finally grown a spine. The thought should have made me feel guilty, but instead, it filled me with a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in decades. For once, their inconvenience wasn't my emergency to solve. For once, they would have to deal with the consequences of treating me like I didn't matter. "I can certainly help you with that," she said warmly. "May I ask the reason for the cancellation?" For a moment, I considered lying, making up some socially acceptable excuse about illness or family emergencies. But something about her gentle tone made me want to tell the truth for once. "Because the people who were supposed to go decided I was too old to join them," I said, and the words hung in the air like a confession I'd been too proud to make before. There was another pause, longer this time, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, not pity, but recognition. "Ma'am, I want you to know that we have many travelers your age who explore the world solo. In fact, some of our most adventurous customers are women over 70. She spoke like she was sharing a secret, like she was part of some underground network of women who refused to let age define their limitations. Would you be interested in hearing about some travel options for yourself? The question hung in the air like an invitation to a party I'd never thought I'd be invited to. Here was this stranger, this woman I'd never meet, offering me possibilities that my own family had decided were beyond my reach. She didn't see my age as a limitation, but as a qualification for adventure, as proof that I'd survived long enough to finally deserve some joy. In that moment, I felt more seen by a stranger than I had by my own family in years. My heart started racing in a way it hadn't since I was 17, and Tommy Henderson asked me to the church social. What kind of options? I heard myself ask, and suddenly I was having a conversation about destinations I'd only seen in magazines and movies. She told me about Tuscany, where cooking classes were held in medieval villages, and where women my age learned to make pasta from grandmothers who treated age as an asset rather than a liability. She described the French countryside, where lavender fields stretched to the horizon and where solo travelers were welcomed with wine and conversation. She painted pictures with words of small Italian coastal towns where time moved slowly and where being alone meant being free rather than being forgotten. Each destination she described sounded like a possibility I'd buried under years of believing that adventure was for other people, younger people, people whose families actually wanted them around. What calls to you? She asked, and I realized nobody had asked me what I wanted in so long that I'd forgotten how to want anything. But sitting there in my silent kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived entirely for others, one word escaped my lips before I could censor it. Everything. She laughed, not mocking, but delighted, like I'd just given the perfect answer to a question she'd been hoping someone would get right. Everything felt like the most honest thing I'd said in years, the truest expression of a hunger I'd been denying for so long. I'd almost convinced myself it didn't exist. I wanted everything. Every sunset I'd missed while doing laundry. Every conversation I'd never had while cooking dinner for people who ate in silence. Every moment of joy I'd postponed while waiting for permission that never came. We settled on a 3-week journey through Italy, starting in Rome and ending in the Amalfi Coast. 3 weeks. When was the last time I'd done anything for 3 weeks that wasn't taking care of someone else? When was the last time I'd made a plan that excited me instead of exhausted me? She walked me through the booking process with the patience of someone who understood that this wasn't just about purchasing airfare. This was about purchasing freedom. Each detail we discussed felt like another brick removed from the wall I'd built around my own desires. Hotels chosen for their charm rather than their proximity to hospitals. Restaurants selected for their atmosphere rather than their nutritional value. Activities planned for pleasure rather than practicality. As I gave her my credit card information, my secret credit card that I'd kept for emergencies, I felt like I was making a down payment on a life I'd abandoned somewhere along the way. When she said, "Congratulations, Mrs. Eleanor Morrison. You're going to Italy," I started crying. Not sad tears, not overwhelmed tears, but tears of recognition, like I was meeting myself again after decades of being a stranger to my own dreams. The tears came from a place so deep I'd forgotten it existed, a place where the woman I used to be was still waiting, still hoping, still believing that it wasn't too late to claim the life that had been sitting there, unclaimed, like luggage at an airport that nobody had bothered to pick up. When I hung up the phone, I sat in the silence of my kitchen for a long moment, letting the reality settle over me like sunlight after a long winter. I was going to Italy. I was going alone. I was going because I wanted to, because I deserved to, because I finally understood that waiting for permission was just another way of choosing to disappear. The woman who had answered that phone an hour ago was different from the woman sitting here now, and that transformation had happened not through some dramatic gesture, but through the simple act of finally saying yes to herself. The morning of my departure, I sat at the kitchen table where I'd fed my family for 47 years and wrote the most honest note of my life. My handwriting looked different somehow, steadier, more confident, Like the woman holding the pen had finally remembered she had something to say. Gone to find myself, I wrote. Back when I'm ready. Water the plants if you remember I exist. Eleanor. I read it 3 times, crossed out the bitter ending, and rewrote it simply. Gone to live. Water the plants. Eleanor. The simplicity of it felt revolutionary, like I was finally speaking a language I'd forgotten I knew. For 47 years, I'd written notes explaining myself, apologizing for my absence, providing detailed instructions as if my temporary disappearance might cause the world to stop spinning. This note explained nothing, and apologized for even less. It was a declaration of independence written in blue ink on grocery store stationery, and it felt more powerful than any manifesto. I left the note propped against the coffee maker they'd expect me to have ready for their return, and something about that small act of rebellion felt more momentous than booking the trip itself. For 47 years, I'd left notes explaining where I'd gone, when I'd be back, what needed to be done in my absence, as if my temporary absence from their lives required detailed instructions for survival. This note explained nothing, and apologized for even less. It was the literary equivalent of finally using my own front door without asking permission. My suitcase sat by the door, a modest rolling bag I'd bought but never used, still bearing the price tag I'd been too guilty to remove, because buying luggage felt presumptuous when I had nowhere to go. Today, I ripped off that tag with the satisfaction of someone finally claiming what was rightfully theirs. Inside were clothes I'd forgotten I owned. A red dress David once said was too young for me. A silk scarf Patricia had called impractical. Sundresses that had hung in my closet like colorful promises I'd never kept to myself. The taxi arrived at exactly 7 a.m., and the driver was a woman about my age with silver hair and laugh lines that spoke of a life well lived. "Where are we headed?" she asked, and when I said the airport, she glanced at my suitcase and smiled. Business or pleasure? It was such a simple question, but I realized nobody had asked me that in decades, because nobody expected my travels to be anything but obligation. Pleasure, I said, and the word felt foreign and wonderful in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd once been fluent in but hadn't practiced in years. As we drove through the city I'd lived in all my life, I saw it differently through the taxi window. The houses looked smaller, the streets narrower, the world more manageable than it had seemed when I'd been trapped within the boundaries of duty and expectation. The driver told me about her own solo trip to Ireland the year before, how she'd kissed the Blarney Stone and danced in pubs, and remembered what it felt like to be nobody's anything except her own everything. "It changed my life," she said, meeting my eyes in the rearview mirror. "I hope it changes yours too." At the airport, I tipped her generously and watched her drive away with something approaching envy, not for her freedom, because I was claiming my own, but for her ease with it, the way she wore her independence like a comfortable coat she'd owned for years. I stood on the curb with my suitcase, watching planes lift off into the sky, and realized that in an hour, I'd be on one of them, flying toward a life I couldn't even imagine yet. Check-in was easier than I'd expected, probably because I'd been imagining airport staff would somehow sense I was a runaway grandmother and alert the authorities. Instead, the cheerful agent handed me my boarding pass and said, "You're going to love Rome, Mrs. Morrison. The weather is perfect this time of year." She spoke like going to Rome was the most natural thing in the world, like 73-year-old women escape to Italy every day without explanation or apology. At the gate, I found myself studying my fellow passengers with the curiosity of an anthropologist discovering a new species. There were young couples taking selfies, business travelers typing furiously on laptops, families with children who would probably remember this trip for the rest of their lives. And then there were women like me, not many, but a few, traveling alone with the quiet confidence of people who had finally learned the difference between being lonely and being alone. I struck up a conversation with the woman sitting next to me, an elegant lady about my age with perfectly styled white hair and a book of Italian phrases. "First time to Italy?" she asked. And when I nodded, she smiled conspiratorially. "Mine too. I'm celebrating my divorce." She said it with such satisfaction that I nearly choked on my airport coffee. After 45 years of marriage, I finally decided I deserved better than a man who treated me like a roommate he'd gotten tired of. Her honesty was refreshing and terrifying in equal measure. "What made you finally leave?" I asked, genuinely curious about this woman who had the courage to uproot her entire life in pursuit of something better. She closed her phrase book and looked at me with eyes that held decades of accumulated wisdom. One morning I woke up and realized I'd been dead for 20 years, but nobody had bothered to bury me. I was still breathing, still cooking his meals, and washing his clothes, and pretending his indifference was love. But the woman I used to be had died so gradually that even I hadn't noticed her passing. Her words hit me like a physical blow, because they described my own life with surgical precision. I wasn't divorced, but I'd been abandoned just the same. Abandoned by my own family, by the son I'd raised to be better than this, by the daughter-in-law who saw me as a burden rather than a blessing. I'd been grieving the death of my marriage to my late husband for 15 years, but I'd never stopped to grieve the death of myself. The slow erosions of Eleanor until all that remained was a collection of services I provided to people who had forgotten to be grateful. "My name is Virginia," she said, extending her hand with the grace of someone who was used to introducing herself, rather than being introduced as someone's wife or mother. "And I have a feeling we're both about to discover who we really are when nobody's watching." As the boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, I shook her hand and felt like I was making a pact with a fellow conspirator in the revolution of late-blooming women everywhere. "I'm Eleanor," I said, and for the first time in decades, I didn't add any qualifiers about whose mother or grandmother I was. I was just Eleanor, and that felt like enough. The plane descended through clouds that looked like the meringue on my grandmother's lemon pie, and suddenly there was Rome spread out below us like a feast I'd been too polite to sample. Virginia squeezed my hand as we touched down, both of us giddy with the realization that we'd actually done it. We'd left our carefully circumscribed lives and landed in a place where nobody knew our histories or our limitations. The Rome airport was controlled chaos, announcements in multiple languages mixing with the excited chatter of travelers from around the world. I followed the crowd toward baggage claim, marveling at how anonymous I felt in the best possible way. Here I wasn't David's mother or Patricia's burden, or the neighborhood lady who always said yes to helping with church fundraisers. I was just another tourist with a rolling suitcase and a guidebook, invisible in my ordinariness but visible in my potential. Virginia and I shared a taxi into the city, and I pressed my nose against the window like a child, drinking in the narrow streets, the ancient buildings, the motorcycles weaving through traffic with death-defying precision. "Look at how they live," Virginia murmured, and I knew she meant the casual way Romans inhabited their incredible city, how they walked past ruins that were older than our entire country, as if beauty was their birthright, rather than their burden. My hotel was a small place near the Spanish Steps, chosen more for its location than its luxury. The desk clerk spoke English with an accent that made everything sound like poetry, and when he handed me my room key, he said, "Welcome to Roma, signora. We hope you find what you're looking for." It was such an unexpected thing to say, so much more meaningful than the standard hospitality greeting, that I wondered if he somehow knew I wasn't just looking for tourist attractions, but for pieces of myself I'd misplaced along the way. My room was tiny but charming, with a window that looked out over terracotta rooftops and a slice of sky that seemed bluer than any sky I'd ever seen in my old life. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed and called Emma, my granddaughter, the only person in my family who still seemed to see me as a complete human being, rather than a collection of convenient services. "Grandma Eleanor? Where are you? Dad's been calling your house all day." Her voice was excited rather than worried, like she'd been hoping I'd finally do something unexpected. "I'm in Rome, sweetheart," I said, and heard her gasp of pure delight on the other end of the line. The sound of her joy at my adventure was worth every moment of guilt I'd been carrying since I'd left that note on the kitchen counter. "You actually did it! You're really traveling!" she squealed, and I realized that someone in my family had been rooting for my escape all along, waiting for me to remember I had wings. That first night in Rome, I stood in front of the small bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back at me, not because I looked different, but because she looked awake. Her eyes had a spark I hadn't seen in years, a curiosity that had been dormant so long I'd assumed it was dead. I'd been moving through life like someone sleepwalking, going through the motions of living without actually experiencing any of it. And now I was staring at a woman who looked like she was finally ready to wake up. I unpacked slowly, hanging up clothes I'd forgotten I owned in the tiny closet that somehow felt more spacious than my walk-in wardrobe at home. Here was the red dress David had criticized, the one that made me feel like a woman instead of a caretaker. Here were the sandals Patricia had called ridiculous for someone your age, as if comfort and style had expiration dates determined by other people's comfort levels. Here was the silk scarf my husband had given me for our 20th anniversary, the one I'd been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to arrive. I laid out my clothes for the next day like I was preparing for a first date with life itself. Tomorrow I would walk the streets of Rome, eat gelato for breakfast if I wanted to, sit in cafes and people watch without checking my phone every 5 minutes to see if someone needed something from me. Tomorrow I would be a tourist in my own existence, exploring the parts of Eleanor that had been closed for renovation for so long I'd forgotten they existed. But first, I needed to do something I should have done years ago. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard as I tried to find words for feelings I'd been suppressing. For so long, they'd calcified into resentment. I started typing. "David, I'm writing this from Rome, where I came after you decided I was too old and too much trouble to include in your travel plans. I'm not writing to make you feel guilty, but to help you understand." I deleted that paragraph and started again. "David, I love you, but I need you to know that the way you've been treating me is unacceptable." Delete. "David, your mother didn't disappear. She just finally decided to matter to someone. Herself." Delete. Finally, I closed the laptop without writing anything at all. Some conversations were better had in person, and some changes were better demonstrated than explained. Instead, I ordered room service, something I'd never done in my entire life because it seemed too extravagant, too self-indulgent, too much like something a person would do if they believed their own comfort mattered. The waiter who brought my dinner was a young man with kind eyes who set up my meal on the small table by the window, like he was serving royalty. When I thanked him in my halting Italian, he beamed and said, "Prego, bella signora," and I felt beautiful for the first time in years. I woke up to Roman sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains and experienced a moment of panic, not because I didn't know where I was, but because for the first time in decades, I had an entire day ahead of me with no obligations to anyone but myself. The silence in my hotel room was different from the silence in my house at home. At home, silence meant waiting, waiting for David to call with a favor, waiting for Patricia to find something wrong with how I'd handled some household task, waiting for the phone to ring with someone else's crisis that would become my emergency. Here in Rome, silence meant possibility. I dressed carefully in my red dress and comfortable walking shoes, pinned my silver hair up in a style I'd seen in a magazine but never had the courage to try, and applied lipstick with the precision of someone preparing for battle. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who was ready for adventure, and that woman was me. Not the me I'd become, the cautious, apologetic, invisible me, but the me I'd been before life taught me that taking up space was selfish. The hotel breakfast room was filled with travelers from around the world, couples consulting guidebooks and families negotiating the complex politics of vacation planning. I took a table by the window and ordered cappuccino and pastries, foods I never ate at home because David said coffee after noon was unhealthy, and Patricia was always making comments about my weight. But this wasn't home. And these weren't people who had opinions about my dietary choices. And for the first time in years, I ate without guilt. Virginia appeared in the breakfast room like a guardian angel of rebellious women, looking elegant in a flowing blue dress and carrying a leather handbag that suggested she was a person who went places and did things. "Eleanor," she called out, and I waved her over to my table with the enthusiasm of someone who had just discovered she was capable of making friends as an adult. "How did you sleep?" she asked, and I realized she was asking because she cared about my answer, not because she was required to make conversation. "Like someone who doesn't have to wake up to anyone else's agenda," I said, and she laughed with the recognition of someone who understood exactly what I meant. We spent the next hour planning our day like two schoolgirls playing hooky, comparing guidebooks and making lists of places we wanted to see. It felt revolutionary to be making plans based on what we wanted to do, rather than what we should do, or what other people expected us to do. "You know what we should do first," Virginia said, leaning across the table conspiratorially. "We should get completely, magnificently lost." It was such a perfect suggestion that I nearly cried. When was the last time I'd allowed myself to be lost? Literally or figuratively. When was the last time I'd wandered without a destination, explored without an agenda, existed without a purpose, beyond my own curiosity and pleasure? We left the hotel with no plan beyond getting lost, and Rome welcomed us like old friends returning from a long absence. The streets were narrow and winding, designed for people who walked instead of people who rushed, and every corner revealed something magical. A fountain carved by masters, a church older than my entire country, cafes where locals sat reading newspapers and arguing about football with the passion most people reserved for life and death matters. Virginia and I moved through the city like explorers, stopping whenever something caught our eye, sitting whenever we felt like sitting, talking to strangers who seemed delighted to give directions to two American women who were clearly having the time of their lives. A fruit vendor insisted we try his peaches, which were so perfect they made me understand why people wrote poetry about food. An elderly man feeding pigeons in a small piazza told us in broken English that we had beautiful spirits, and that Rome was lucky to have us. We found ourselves at the Trevi Fountain, surrounded by tourists throwing coins over their shoulders and making wishes they probably didn't really believe would come true. Virginia pulled out 2 coins and handed me one. "What are you going to wish for?" she asked, and I realized I hadn't made a wish in so long. I'd forgotten how it felt to want something that wasn't practical or necessary or centered around someone else's needs. I closed my eyes and made a wish so selfish and so overdue that it felt like a prayer I should have been saying for years. I wished to matter, not to matter to my family in the way a useful appliance matters, but to matter to myself in the way a human being should matter to herself. I wished to take up space without apologizing, to have opinions without permission, to make choices based on my own desires rather than other people's convenience. I threw that coin into the fountain with the force of 47 years of suppressed wanting. "What did you wish for?" Virginia asked as we walked away from the fountain, and I told her. She stopped walking and hugged me right there on the busy street, with tourists streaming around us and street performers playing music that sounded like celebration. "That's not selfish," she said fiercely. "That's survival. That's what I wished for too, to matter to myself as much as I mattered to everyone else." That afternoon, we sat in a sidewalk cafe drinking wine at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because we were adults and we could, watching the beautiful chaos of Roman life unfold around us like a movie I'd never been invited to see. The wine was crisp and golden, tasting of sunshine and freedom, while the warm breeze carried the scent of jasmine from a nearby balcony garden. Young couples walked by holding hands with the casual confidence of people who had never doubted their right to happiness, while older couples sat at neighboring tables, sharing newspapers and comfortable silences that spoke of decades of choosing each other every day. Street musicians played accordion melodies that seemed to weave through the afternoon air like golden thread, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the splash of fountain water against ancient stone. "I feel guilty," I confessed to Virginia, "for leaving without explanation, for spending this money on myself, for enjoying this so much when I should probably be home making sure everyone's okay." Virginia looked at me with the patience of someone who had fought this same battle with herself and won, her silver hair catching the late afternoon light, like a crown she'd finally learned to wear. My phone rang while Virginia and I were sharing tiramisu at a cafe near the Pantheon, and my stomach clenched when I saw David's name on the screen. For a moment, I considered not answering, but decades of maternal conditioning made it impossible to ignore my child's call, even when that child was a 50-year-old man who had apparently forgotten how to treat his mother with basic respect. I answered with a heart full of dread and a mouth still sweet with dessert. "Mom, what the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was sharp with anger and embarrassment, the tone he used when he felt his authority was being questioned. "Mrs. Henderson saw a taxi at the house, and when I came by to check on you, I found that ridiculous note. Patricia is furious. We cut our trip short to deal with this crisis you've created." Crisis. As if my decision to finally live my life was some kind of natural disaster that required emergency management. "Hello, David," I said calmly, Virginia watching my face with concern and solidarity. "I'm having tiramisu in Rome. How was Portugal?" The silence on the other end of the line was so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. But then I heard him sputtering with the kind of outrage reserved for moments when the natural order of things is disrupted by someone who was supposed to stay in their assigned place forever. "Rome? Mom, you can't just disappear to Rome. You're 73 years old. What if something happens to you? What if you get sick or lost or—" He continued listing all the catastrophes that could befall a woman my age who had the audacity to leave her house without permission. But I stopped listening. Instead, I watched Virginia's face as she eavesdropped on the conversation, her expression shifting from concern to anger to something that looked like recognition of a battle she'd fought herself. "David," I interrupted his litany of fears, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am not having a breakdown. I am not endangering myself. I am not punishing you, although I'm certainly disappointed in how you've been treating me. I am simply living my life for the first time in decades, and if that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps you should examine why my happiness feels like a threat to you." The silence this time was different. Not angry, but stunned, like he was hearing his mother speak in a language he didn't recognize. When he finally responded, his voice was smaller, more confused than commanding. "But Mom, what about the house? What about your responsibilities? What about us?" And there it was, the heart of the matter. What about their convenience? What about their assumption that I would always be available, always grateful, always willing to make myself smaller so they could feel bigger? Virginia squeezed my hand as I took a deep breath and prepared to have the most honest conversation I had had with my family in years. "David, I love you, but I need you to understand something. For 47 years, I have been available for every crisis, every favor, every moment when you needed me. I raised you, supported you, helped you build your life, and I've been happy to do it. But somewhere along the way, you forgot that I'm not just your resource. I'm a person with my own needs and dreams and desires." "But Mom," he started. But I wasn't finished. This conversation had been building for years, and now that I'd started, the words poured out like water through a broken dam. "You excluded me from your trip not because I couldn't handle it, but because including me was inconvenient. You handed me a list of household chores like I was your employee, rather than your mother. You made decisions about my life without consulting me, and when I finally made a decision for myself, you called it a crisis." I could hear Patricia in the background, her voice sharp with indignation, and then David put me on speakerphone. "Eleanor," Patricia said, using my first name with the kind of careful pronunciation that suggested she was trying very hard to sound reasonable. "We understand you're upset, but running away to Europe isn't going to solve anything. You're being impulsive and, frankly, a little selfish. We have responsibilities, and part of those responsibilities is making sure you're safe and taken care of." Virginia rolled her eyes so dramatically I almost laughed out loud. "Patricia," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded, "I don't need to be taken care of. I need to be treated with respect. There's a difference between caring for someone and controlling them, and you've crossed that line so many times you can't even see it anymore." "What do you want from us?" David asked, and for the first time in this conversation, he sounded genuinely curious, rather than angry or defensive. "Do you want an apology? Do you want us to invite you on every trip? Do you want us to pretend that age doesn't matter, and that you can do everything you could do when you were 30? His questions revealed everything that was wrong with how they saw me, as someone whose limitations were more significant than her capabilities, whose age was more relevant than her autonomy. "What I want," I said, looking out at the Roman street, where people of all ages were living their lives with dignity and purpose, "is to be treated like a member of this family, not like a burden you're managing. I want to be consulted about decisions that affect me. I want to be included unless there's a genuinely good reason not to include me. And I want you to stop assuming that my age makes me incompetent or irrelevant." I paused, gathering courage for what I needed to say next. "And I want you to understand that if you can't do those things, I'll need to reconsider how much of my life I'm willing to share with people who don't value me." The next morning brought a voice message from Emma that made me cry happy tears while I ate breakfast on my hotel balcony. "Grandma Eleanor!" Her young voice bubbled with excitement and pride. "I am so incredibly proud of you I could burst. Dad showed me the pictures you posted from Rome, and you look absolutely radiant. You look like you're glowing from the inside out. I've been showing everyone at work, telling them about my badass grandmother, who's traveling solo through Italy at 73. She paused in the recording, and I could hear her moving around, probably getting ready for work or school. "I need you to know something, Grandma. You've been my hero my whole life, but not because of all the things you did for our family. You've been my hero because of who you are. Your kindness, your strength, your wisdom, your humor. Seeing you finally choose yourself doesn't make me respect you less. It makes me respect you more. You're showing me what it looks like to never give up on your own dreams." The message continued as I wiped tears from my cheeks, Virginia appearing on the balcony next to mine, with her own cup of coffee, and a knowing smile. "Dad and Patricia are being ridiculous," Emma continued. "They're acting like you committed some crime by taking a vacation. Mom keeps saying you're going through something, like happiness is a symptom of illness. But I see what's really happening. You're not going through something. You're finally going toward something. You're going toward the life you deserve." I played the message for Virginia, who dabbed at her own eyes and declared Emma a treasure worth keeping. We spent the morning planning our day over cappuccino and cornetti, two women who were finally learning that planning for pleasure was not only acceptable, but necessary. Today we would visit the Vatican museums, not because we should, but because we wanted to see Michelangelo's ceiling and remember what human beings were capable of creating when they believed in something larger than themselves. "You know what I love about your granddaughter," Virginia said, as we prepared to leave for our day of art and wonder. "She sees your adventure as inspiration, not abandonment. She understands that watching someone you love choose happiness is a gift, not a betrayal." It was true, and it made me realize how much I'd been starving for someone to celebrate my joy instead of questioning it, to see my growth as beautiful rather than threatening. That afternoon, standing in the Sistine Chapel with my neck craned back to take in the impossible beauty above me, I thought about creation and recreation, about how sometimes you have to break something apart before you can build it into something better. Michelangelo had painted this masterpiece when he was in his 30s, but that didn't mean beauty had to be the province of youth. Maybe I was creating my own masterpiece now, painting a new life with colors I'd been too afraid to use before. 3 weeks later, I stood in my own kitchen again, but everything was different. Not the kitchen itself. David and Patricia had, to their credit, kept the plants alive and the house clean. But me. I was different in ways both subtle and profound. Like a photograph that's been touched up by an expert hand, I moved through familiar spaces with new confidence, claimed my own counter space for my Italian coffee and the small souvenirs I'd bought for myself, not for anyone else. Emma arrived within an hour of my return, throwing herself into my arms with the enthusiasm of someone greeting a returning war hero. "Tell me everything," she demanded, settling into the kitchen chair that had always been hers during our long talks. "Start with the plain, and don't leave out a single detail." So I told her about Virginia, about the fountains and the art and the wine at 3 in the afternoon, about the way Roman sunlight felt different on my skin, about learning to say mi scusi and grazie and sono felice. "I am happy." "You look like you found yourself," Emma said, studying my face with the intensity of someone examining a precious work of art. "Not like you changed, but like you remembered who you were before everyone else told you who you should be." Her words were so precisely accurate they took my breath away. I hadn't become someone new in Italy. I'd excavated someone old, someone I'd buried under layers of other people's expectations, and my own misguided belief that loving others meant disappearing myself. David arrived that evening with Patricia, both of them carrying the uncomfortable energy of people who weren't sure what rules applied anymore. They sat stiffly at my kitchen table, the same table where they'd dismissed my dreams just a month before, and I served them coffee in my good china, not because they deserved it, but because I deserved to use beautiful things without waiting for special occasions that might never come. The silence stretched between us like a bridge none of us was sure how to cross. "Mom," David finally said, his voice carefully modulated in the way that suggested Patricia had coached him on this conversation. "We need to talk about what happened. Patricia and I have been discussing your trip, and we want you to know that we're concerned about this new phase you're going through." Phase, as if happiness was something I would outgrow, like teenage rebellion, or a temporary illness that would run its course if they waited patiently enough. I set down my coffee cup with deliberate precision and looked at my son, really looked at him, for the first time in years. When had he become this man who spoke about my joy like it was a problem to be solved? When had I raised someone who could sit at my table and pathologize my decision to finally matter to myself? "David," I said quietly, "I'm not going through a phase. I'm going through a transformation. There's a difference." Patricia shifted in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, and I realized she was afraid, not afraid that I would leave again, though that was part of it, but afraid that my awakening would somehow diminish her position in the family hierarchy. For years, she'd been the decision-maker, the one who determined what was reasonable and appropriate for everyone else, including me. My independence threatened that carefully constructed dynamic. "What exactly do you want from us?" "Eleanor," Patricia asked, using my name like it was a foreign word she was still learning to pronounce. "Do you want us to pretend that your age doesn't matter? Do you want us to stop caring about your safety and well-being? Do you want us to treat you like you're 30 years old when you're not?" Her questions revealed everything wrong with how she saw aging, as a disease rather than an achievement, as limitation rather than liberation, as something that happened to me rather than something I was living through, with grace and dignity. The conversation that followed was the most honest one we'd had in years, painful in the way that surgery is painful, necessary for healing, but excruciating in the moment. David admitted that he'd been treating me like a possession rather than a person, making decisions about my life as if my opinion was optional rather than essential. Patricia acknowledged that she'd been threatened by my presence in their lives, seeing me as competition rather than support, as judgment rather than wisdom. "I don't want to fight with you," David said, and I could see the little boy he'd once been, the one who'd run to me with scraped knees and broken hearts, believing I could fix anything. "I love you, Mom, and I want you to be happy. I just don't know how to navigate this new version of you." His honesty was a gift I hadn't expected, vulnerable in a way that reminded me why I'd moved mountains to raise him right. The new version of me is actually the old version of me, I told him gently. The version that existed before I learned to make herself small enough to fit into other people's comfort zones. The version that had opinions and dreams and desires before I convinced myself that wanting things was selfish. You don't have to navigate me, David. You just have to respect me. The words hung in the air between us like a peace treaty waiting to be signed. Emma appeared in the doorway then, as if summoned by some family GPS that told her when serious conversations were happening. She looked around the table at the three adults who were finally learning how to be honest with each other, and her face broke into a smile that could have powered the city. "Are we finally having the conversation we should have had years ago?" she asked, pulling up a chair like she belonged at this table of truth-telling, which, of course, she did. "Your grandmother thinks she can just disappear to Europe whenever she wants," Patricia said, but her tone had shifted from accusation to something approaching bewilderment, like she was genuinely trying to understand a foreign concept. Emma laughed, not mockingly, but with the delight of someone who'd been waiting for this moment her whole life. "Good for her," Emma said firmly. "Grandma Eleanor, I hope you disappear to Europe every chance you get. I hope you disappear to Asia and Africa and South America. I hope you disappear so often that people forget you were ever the woman who lived her entire life for other people." 6 months have passed since I returned from Rome, and I look in my mirror every morning now, not to criticize the woman I see there, but to greet her like an old friend I'm getting to know again. She wears colors that make her happy, jewelry that catches the light, scarves that dance when she walks. She has plans that excite her, and friendships that nourish her soul. She's not perfect, but she's present in her own life in a way she hadn't been for decades. Virginia and I meet every month, sometimes for coffee in the city, sometimes for day trips to places we've never seen. We're planning another adventure for next year. Greece, maybe, or Morocco, or perhaps that cooking class in Tuscany we read about in a travel magazine. We call ourselves the Late Bloomer Society. Membership open to any woman who's finally decided she's tired of waiting for permission to live her life. David and Patricia have kept their promises, mostly. There are still moments when they slip back into old patterns, treating me like a convenience rather than a person. But now I have the confidence to speak up immediately. "That's not how we do things anymore," I say, and they adjust. It's remarkable how much people can change their behavior when you stop accepting less than you deserve. Emma starts college next month, and she's chosen to study abroad her junior year because, she says, watching me find my courage gave her permission to find her own. The house feels different now too, not like a museum of my former life, but like a home base for the adventures still to come. I've redecorated my bedroom in colors that make me smile, claimed the sunroom as my reading nook, planted a garden full of flowers I chose because they're beautiful, not because they're practical. I've learned to say no without explaining myself and yes without asking permission. Last week I received a handwritten letter from David. Not an email or a text, but actual paper and ink. The kind of communication that requires time and thought. "Mom," he wrote, "I want you to know that watching you remember who you are has made me want to be a better son. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to change course, and it's never wrong to choose happiness. I love the woman you've become, and I'm sorry it took me so long to see her." I didn't answer the letter immediately. Some words are too precious to rush, and some forgiveness needs time to ripen into something real and lasting. Instead, I put on my red dress and my silk scarf and my comfortable walking shoes, and I went to the art museum downtown because I've learned that the best response to love is living fully. If this story spoke to your heart, if you see yourself in my journey from invisible to vibrant, I want you to know something crucial. It's never too late to remember who you are beneath all the roles you've played for other people. It's never too late to book the ticket, wear the dress, learn the language, dance with the stranger. Matter to yourself as much as you've mattered to everyone else. The woman in my mirror now knows something the old Eleanor forgot. We don't get smaller as we age. We get distilled into our truest selves, concentrated into the essence of who we were always meant to be. Age isn't a limitation. It's a qualification for finally knowing what matters and having the courage to pursue it. If my story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear that dreams don't have expiration dates and adventures don't have age limits. Leave me a comment about a time you chose yourself or a dream you're still afraid to pursue. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories about women who refuse to become invisible just because the world expects them to disappear, please subscribe and join our community of late bloomers who are just getting started. Thank you to Letters to Helen for giving me this space to share my heart with all of you beautiful souls. Remember, you're not too old to bloom again. You're exactly the right age to finally live.